Uh, Good afternoon, everybody. Greetings from Torino for those who are not here. Torino is a place in whose university Lorenzo Tomatis and I graduated in 1953. Lorenzo Tomatis, as you can imagine, is going to be a sort of prima donna in my presentation. But before non va, come faccio qui? Before referring to Reggio Tomatis and events taking place more than 50 years ago, I would like to quote something from 2500 years ago, and that is Plato. And these words that all knowledge, when separated from justice and virtue, is seen to be cunning and not wisdom. These words have been somehow the guideline along which a program of the monographs on carcinogenic hazards of IARC has developed. I guess that most of you are familiar with the monographs. These are the first volume, which was published 50 years ago, and the most recent volume, number 128, which has been published a few months ago. And I would like to remind you how the program on evaluation of carcinogenic hazards and the whole International Agency for Research in Cancer started during the 60s, around 1963 to 68, thanks to an initiative of Louis Armand Dastier. He had been a hero in the underground war in France in the 40s, and he and 11 other high-profile people from France sent a letter to General de Gaulle suggesting that the major powers, United States, Britain, Russia, Soviet Union, and France, should divert 0.05% of their military budget for research on cancer, pointing out that there will be no final victory on cancer as long as causes of cancer were not discovered and fought against. Yeah. So that is how the agency started. That is how Reggio Tomatis reached the agency around 1968. And in that context, Reggio Tomatis devised and designed the monograph program. This picture is from a preliminary meeting in 1971 taking place in the town hall of Lyon. The people sitting at this table, left to right, are Umberto Saffiotti, Eric Boyland, René Truot, David Clayson, Philip Schuwick, Reggio Tomatis, myself, and Dietrich, I remember his name, Hemschler, designing the program. I was sitting next to Renzo because I had been indicated as a rapporteur of that meeting. I must tell you that on those occasions, I learned how important the rapporteur of a meeting is, and that is a recommendation I would make to all the young people participating to meetings. Well, at the beginning of the monograph program, the idea under request of both trade unions and industry was to prepare a list of carcinogens. Our idea was to prepare two lists, as a matter of fact. One, a list of agents known to cause cancer in man, which in those days there were some, but not very many, and a list of chemicals which have been shown to be carcinogenic in animals. We found out that was not a good idea. Any list was supposed to be very rigid, in and out, just two possibilities, uh, to take into account the multiple aspects required for a proper evaluation. And it would have been impossible to include in any given list chemicals for which the quantity and quality of the available data vary considerably. And last but not least, there is a danger. There is always a danger with lists that that is to be interpreted in the sense that if something is not in the list, something is not of a list in the list of hazardous agents, that it is safe by definition. There is much misunderstanding. So from there, the idea of preparing monographs to be circulated. I must say that the monographs between 1971 and the end of 1980s, there was much evolution in the awareness of the mission of the monographs. This was the list of members of the working group preparing the first monograph, which appeared in 1971. Well, what can be said about these people? That all of them, perhaps with the possible exception of Robert Miller, who was a pediatrician working at the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda, but we were all people who in those days were working in experimental carcinogenesis, doing experiments in animals. None of these people could be characterized as an epidemiologist, etc. Well, this reflects what the investigation of cancer causes was in those days. Some epidemiology had been done, of course, particularly with regard to lung cancer and cancer of the bladder. But in general, in the scientific milieu, this is just a very simple exercise I went through the other day to count the number of quotations in Medline under the entry of carcinogenesis and under the entry of cancer epidemiology. And you can see that not only the difference in absolute numbers between 1960 and 2020, which is to be expected, but also how the ratio of experimental to epidemiological studies has changed over the time. So at least this is a list of the chemicals which were investigated. There were some concerns in recent times about why those chemicals and not others. But I remember very well that the final decision was to take a number of chemicals of different chemical groups of different with different effects. And to see how the monograph system would work. So that was a sort of experiment. How did the monographs ended in that first volume? These are just two examples regarding benzidine and chloroform, and I don't want you to read all the details, but the idea was, okay, let's say what the animal data they say and what the epidemiological data say, and let the reader to decide whether that is a hazard or not. So the idea of how to report findings and how to report evaluations, there was much debate, as a matter of fact, between 1971 and along the 80s. Combining findings, the idea was that there is a need to categorize the relevance to public health of the evidences ranging from inadequate to convincing proof of the potential for an agent to cause cancer in humans. And terms defining each category were supposed to take into account all the available published scientific information on each agent. As you know, a firm point of the monograph program has always been that only published literature, published scientific findings are to be taken into consideration. If you wish, we can discuss it later about this. Around the end of the 1980s, when Supplement 7 was published, unambiguous, practical, and verifiable terms were found. And that is that these more or less persisted with minor changes over the last 40 years. And this is a present situation on the evaluations of carcinogenic hazards. A total of more than 1,000 agents have been evaluated, and that is the distribution between the four main categories, that is carcinogenic to humans, probably carcinogenic to humans, possibly carcinogenic to humans, and non-classifiable for carcinogenicity. Okay, so let's make one point from now on, and that is 48%, almost half of the agents which have been brought to the attention of working groups, of IARC working groups. For almost half of these, the available scientific information was found to be inadequate for an evaluation. And note that the agents which are brought to the attention of IARC and therefore of its working groups, they require a minimum of information. If an agent agents for which there is absolutely no information on the chemical structure, on the acute effects, on the possibility of a carcinogenic effect, are not taken into consideration. So the distribution which we have just seen does not reflect the distribution of all chemicals, all environmental agents. It is the distribution of a number of environmental agents for which a minimum indication of a possible carcinogenic effect required a full evaluation of the scientific information. I insist on this because one of the comments, one of the criticisms, and we are going to go a little bit deeper on this, but which is made to IARC, particularly from the industrial world, is that IARC is too sensitive for recognizing environmental carcinogens. Keep in mind that half of the agents brought to the attention of IARC were deemed to be insufficiently documented to produce an evaluation. Well, let's go back to retrotomatics at this stage, and I don't know how many of you, particularly outside Torino, have ever seen this publication, which is a supplement to the Italian Journal of Epidemiology, Epidemiologia e Prevenzione, published in 2009 or 2008. This is a posthumous publication of Renzo, which was just starting. There were 50 type pages, or perhaps less, 45, something like that. The title of which is how the monographs, IARC monographs project was born. And obviously it contains a series of personal considerations. It is halfway between a report and a novel, as many of Renzo's publications were, but which is extremely interesting to understand what he had in mind and to make it known. For instance, one of the statements that he made is that in order to make sure for the project to be useful to those who are exposed to harmful chemicals and for the monographs to become an effective tool for their protection, I had to get rid of the academic approach and to dissent from the statement of the official academic establishment. This is a strong statement, very, very interesting, and I mean, it brings us to try to understand what does he mean? What does he mean when he says to get rid of the academic approach and dissent from statements of the official academic establishment. But to start with, it brings us back to the reference of Plato, which I showed at the beginning of my presentation. But Renzo, in another publication, well, he points out something which most of us agree with, that there are two approaches to primary prevention. Taking for granted the basic good faith, that is another issue. One is that a possible approach is that absolute scientific certainty is a priority over preventive action, unless you are 100% sure that something is harmful. More research is needed, and we shall go back to these fatidic words later. The other attitude is that measures for health protection are a priority over the attainment of absolute scientific certainty. And naturally, this is Renzo's choice. It is also my choice. It should be, and it's also the choice of the unit of the monograph production at IARC, with the exception of a short period around the turn of the millennium, in which the general strategy had been changed, fortunately, just for a few years. Since the decision to follow the second line, obviously over the years and over the decades, has produced a strong reaction from the interests which have been heard by IARC decision. That's what many of us call the product defense science as a reaction to IARC evaluations. This it's more and more used in these days because, unfortunately, product defense science is occupying more and more space in the scientific production. It is supposed to encompass research activities whose goals are not scientific knowledge, but to influence policy decisions on the use of industrial products. The examples which I could mention are hundreds probably. The circumstances in which IARC evaluations have been attacked very, very strongly by industries, just to quote the major ones regarding the evaluation of glyphosate, of passive tobacco smoke, of chrysotile asbestos, of diesel exhaust, styrene, formaldehyde, red meat, 1,3-butadiene, and I go back to 1,3-butadiene a little bit. That is the reality of today, and that is the reality that Renzo was able to foresee well in advance to the onset of the monograph program. I will now go on to some specific points of some features of the monograph program, which Renzo had a role in, which I have been thinking about for a little bit. One point is this category of possible carcinogens, and that this has been an item about which industry has attacked IARC. So what do we need for characterize? Why should we characterize chemicals as possible carcinogens? Well, the reply was given by Renzo itself, and that is a category for which obviously there is very little interest. It is unlikely that any epidemiologist would start investigating the possibility of a chemical investigate with an epidemiological study chemicals labeled as epidemiological, as a possible carcinogen. The evidence is weak, the evidence is limited. Nobody would dare to put his hands on the fire to say that that's an important substance. But if IARC has done the effort of saying, well, look, we cannot say that this is carcinogen, but there is some suggestion. Why should we forget about this? We are not making harm to anybody in saying that this is a possible carcinogen. As he said that indiscriminate downgrading of the results would result in elimination of the only indication of potential hazard to humans for a considerable number of environmental chemicals and chemicals mixed. I understand that at IARC there was some discussion about the survival of the category possible carcinogen, and I understand that happily, fortunately, the final decision was to not to eliminate this category. Well, the two major criticisms which are made, the major criticism which is made to IARC is that there are too many, the risk of false positives with higher criteria exists. Well, in the first place, as I showed you, almost half of the chemicals which have been investigated by IARC have been labeled as there is inadequate evidence. So you cannot accuse IARC to be excessively sensitive in recognizing carcinogens. Second, IARC has its rule. The major rule, the crucial rule, is that replication independent by two different studies, either as epidemiological studies or as experimental studies, is the best convincing way of checking for chance findings. Hazard evaluations rely heavily on reproducibility and independent studies. These are something which had been said by Austin Bradford Hill in the early 60s, which is still extremely valid. Much less attention, particularly in the industrial milieu, is given to false negatives. It is an epidemiological study or an experimental study in laboratory animals in order to have a high statistical power, which is to recognize the probability to recognize the fact if the fact exists. Well, that requires sophisticated studies, complicated studies, well-designed studies, and many studies which circulate regarding epidemiology of environmental cancer or experimental studies do not show low statistical power, or there is no differential misclassification of exposure and or outcome, which, as you all know, reduces artificially the relative risk. Too short follow-up in cohort studies, overmatching. Well, you have better epidemiology than I am, and I guess that you could add many other features of imperfect epidemiological studies to this list. As for work in experimental animals, this has been a target of criticism to IARC, that for assuming based on several statements, etc. To start with, IARC does not create a experimental studies positive period. To state that there is sufficient evidence of experimental evidence of carcinogenicity, some items are required, and basically the reproducibility of findings within the same animal species or between animal species. And the statement which more or less since volume 15. I don't remember exactly. Which is appearing in the volumes of the monograph, that in the absence of adequate data on humans, it is biologically plausible and prudent to regard agents and mixtures for which there is sufficient evidence of carcinogenicity in experimental animals as if they presented a carcinogenic risk in humans. That is a constant. And the criticisms which are raised from the other side is that administered doses are much higher than those to which humans are exposed, that the routes of administration do not correspond to the circumstances of humans' exposure. Cancer sites in laboratory animals do not correspond to suspected target organs in humans, that mice and rats are excessively susceptible to effects of carcinogens, and that any agent produces cancer in these species. This is not true, absolutely. And also the fact that smoking cigarettes, smoking tobacco by animals has produced equivocal results with regard to lung cancer. Each of these points can be contradicted very easily, and I would recommend you to read any paper by Renzo Tomatis to get convinced that any of these points is wrong. The fact is that parallel to the shift of the attention towards epidemiological studies, the attention to experimental studies has decreased. Let me show you an example. Let's talk about DDT. DDT has been evaluated by IARC for its carcinogenicity 4 times, which are big. Currently, the evidence, there is no epidemiological evidence, but there is sufficient evidence of DDT producing cancer in mice, rats, and other animal species. And in addition, more recently, it has been shown that there are 3 characteristics of non-human carcinogens which DDT has. That is not a white or black item, but it is supportive information. So nowadays, the public opinion is informed that DDT is a probable I'm sorry, this is confused. That was 2B and 2A and 2B are inverted in this slide. I apologize. Nowadays, DDT is a probable carcinogen for men. One of historically, that is, it is interesting to see what the first director of IARC, Dr. John Higginson, said in 1985 about DDT. He had just left the position of director. He was a past director of IARC since about one year. And experiments were going on. Some experiments have already been published, and these were experiments carried out in IARC, and some of them have been carried out in the National Cancer Institute in Milan, where I was working, and I was responsible for those experiments. Well, while some evidence of carcinogenicity was coming to the surface from the experimental studies, he came out with this type of statement that the assessment of risks from DDT is largely dependent on inferences from descriptive epidemiology. Let's forget about experimental studies. There is no correlation at the population level which can demonstrate a correlation between exposures and DDT and incidence of cancer. DDT is a non-genotoxic carcinogen. And today, nobody would define DDT as a non-genotoxic carcinogen. And finally, DDT has had no significant impact on human cancer patterns, and it is unlikely to be an important carcinogen for men. at previous exposure levels within the statistical limitation of these data. This statement made by the ex-director of the International Agency for Research of Cancer had a great impact on the public opinion and also on general feelings in the scientific another item I would like to mention regards transparency. Something which I have always liked in IARC monograph is the following. Well, let's say that about 1,000 agents have been evaluated. The procedure which is recommended, which is followed by the working groups, is that of reaching a consensus. The fact that the working group is multidisciplinary, it implies also that there is a form of control of experts in one area over experts in the other area. Let's say that experts in chemistry have always been very attentive to what epidemiologists say. They devoted much time and much attention to in order to understand what is the reasoning of the other experts in the working group. So generally, definitions, categorization is reached by consensus. There have been exceptions, I think. And the attitude of IARC has always been to have to make the dissent public. If you on occasions, there is a footnote in the page of the report regarding evaluation, say a part of the group did not agree, or Dr. So and so did not agree. For instance, one item which I like much is how IARC has evaluated the association between asbestos and intestinal cancer. You know, this is a very hot question in Italy. It's very, very, very highly debated. In volume 100C, where the issue of asbestos and colorectal cancer has been analyzed, well, there was no agreement. It is stated in the monograph that the working group was evenly divided as to whether the evidence was strong enough to warrant classification as sufficient. The purpose of the monograph is to inform, is to transmit information. Okay, we want information. We want the people to know that half of the scientists have an opinion and the other half have the other. As I've told you, this has happened on very, very, very few occasions. It has happened in other circumstances which I was involved, and which did not end. I'm sorry. Which did not end as I would have liked, and that this again occurred in the period following Renzo's retirement, when the director of the agency was Dr. Paul Klihos. He was a neurobiologist, a very good scientist. Incidentally, he had forbade Renzo to enter the building of the agency, just to not to create confusion. The monograph program was run by Dr. Jerry Rice. In that particular meeting regarding one-tributadiene, I was the chairman of that working group. And again, there we got a situation in which the discussion was, in those days, was whether one-tributadiene was a carcinogen or a probable carcinogen. Parenthesis, a few years later, there was another meeting on the one-tributadiene, and the conclusion was that it is a carcinogen. But on that in 1988, not everybody agreed. And at the vote, 14 members of the committee had expressed an opinion for probable carcinogen and 14 for full carcinogen instead. Okay, so the majority decided that it was a probable carcinogen, all right. I was the chairman of the committee, and I asked the responsible of the Monograph program, please to include a footnote stating, letting the people know about it. My request has never been accepted by Dr. Jerry Rice, and this has created, I have been I have been deeply disturbed by this situation. Well, I guess that we are approaching the end of my talk. I just would like to mention two issues. One is to return to Renzo's work, and this is a statement which I have always liked, again, from this publication, that for most diseases, the identification of causes has captivated the general consensus about the measures to be taken in order to prevent and cure them, particularly for infectious diseases. But in the case of cancer, on the contrary, the identification of a chemical or a mixture to be a cause of cancer has received with hostility. Good, nice word, it's too kind, probably. The recognition of a chemical as a cause of cancer has invariably met with a strong opposition by those who dominate the financial power and are also in the condition of molding the political decisions. This is an important message, but this is a comment from a wise man, a good observer on how the world works. To finish, I would like to, since my position of being an old man talking to young people, if you allow me to do so, I would like to list some advices for young investigators on cancer prevention. Well, in the first place, remember that preventing cancer is more ethical and cheaper than letting people develop cancer and cure it. Do not underestimate the results of experimental studies in vitro, and be a little bit in favor of experiments in animals. Don't let you be seduced by some positions of the pro animal animalist people. The other thing, don't label carcinogens as strong or weak. It doesn't make any difference. The risk is determined by the number of people who are exposed and by the extent of the exposure. So the use of adjectives, additional adjectives to categorize a carcinogen does not make any sense. Last one, I must go to another Italian here, that is Rodolfo Saracchi. Most of you students of the master have met him. That when interpreting the literature, be impartial and non-neutral. What does he mean? Impartiality implies that when you have a piece of scientific information, you ought to look at it regardless where it comes from and with no prejudices, to analyze it by itself. On the other hand, you have to be non-neutral, and that is that since there is always some residual uncertainties from science, you must interpret that these are residual uncertainty pro people's health and not for other persons' interests. And finally, that if you conclude that further research is needed, that is the acronym of these four words is FORIN, and in the literature you find very often this acronym. You have to specify which type of risk, which type of extra research you are looking at. And if you are attaining an absolute certainty and some missed off, some piece of information is missing to be certain 100%, okay, that's stated. But otherwise, your statement will be interpreted in the sense that current knowledge is not enough to take any initiative for prevention, and let's see and let's wait. And these ambiguity has characterized much of the history of environmental carcinogenesis. I guess that I shall stop here. I've been in time, have I? Okay. And I shall be happy to reply to any question. Lorenzo, I'd just like you to see that soon.
Let's see what happens if I speak here. It seems to work. Okay. Okay, thank you, Benedetto. This was a great presentation. I'm going to take this away.
Yeah, thank you.
And it was really great presentation and a lot of, especially the last slide with a lot of take-home messages. You can't hear me? My face. Well, you can see Benedetto's face. Okay. Okay. Now I would like to invite two persons, two colleagues to comment on your presentation. And the first one, as I said at the beginning, will be the current director of the Monograph program, Erich Bauer. I hope that you can unmute your microphone and we will be able to hear you. Can you try to speak and welcome?
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Shall I see her?
Hello? Can anyone hear me? I've tried to unmute.
Okay. Can you try to speak again?
Yes, hello. I think you can now see me on video as well. Is that right? Can you hear me? Great. I understand it. I can be heard. First of all, Benedetto, thank you so much for those incredible recollections that you shared with us. I'm speaking here on behalf of all of the scientists in the Monographs program, and also on behalf of our director, Dr. Elisabetta Weiderpass, who sent her best regards and wishes that she could be here as well. However, this is the last day of our scientific council meeting this year, so she was unable to attend, but we'll watch it on video as soon as it's available. I would wish to just make a few points in response to your incredible presentation. The memories you shared are truly a treasure for us in the program. And for those of you who don't know me, my background is occupational epidemiology. I've been in the monographs for 3.5 years. And again, it was fascinating to listen to your recollection. I think it's really interesting to hear your insight on why certain agents were chosen for Volume 1. We've often wondered that ourselves in the program. And I took the opportunity to look up the current status of those agents, and it turns out that 8 of them are in Group 1 and having substantial cancer epidemiology evidence to support that. Just 3 are in Group 2A, 6 are in Group 2B, and only a couple of them are in Group 3. So I think we can see that the evidence has certainly advanced, in particular in cancer epidemiology for many of these agents. So despite our concerns about cancer epidemiology not being able to answer these questions about individual chemicals or metals, in fact, they actually have been able to do so through the intervening 50 years that we've experienced. I was also fascinated to hear your points about transparency being an important precept within the program, and you'll be happy to hear that this has remained the case with the current program. We had a revision of our preamble, which, as you know, is the guiding principles behind the monographs evaluations. And this topic of transparency and fairly recording the intent of the working group was discussed at length, and it was reconfirmed that we would wish to continue to capture the viewpoints of minority members or minority opinions within the working group. And so if you take the time to peruse some of our recent volumes, including Night Shift Work in Volume 124, you'll see the expression of passionate minority opinions within those volumes. In addition, transparency, I think, also applies to conflicts of interest. And I would be interested to hear your take on that topic. I think there may have been people present at the Volume 1 meeting who might not be able to participate in full capacity under our current rules. And I think that is evidence of our increasing attention to conflicts of interest and their role at the monographs meetings. So I'd really love to hear your thoughts on that. And then I very much appreciate, although I'm an epidemiologist, I really enjoyed your comments about the importance of in vivo studies in animals. And I think that is something that concerns those of us in the program, that these studies are becoming less frequently conducted and available, and yet they are very important, as you've noted. At the same time, there's been an increase in interest in mechanistic evidence. And so that was one of the major changes in our new preamble, was continuing to strengthen that as a source of evidence that could be used in advance of people actually getting cancer, to allow us to classify agents in group 2B, group 2A, or even group 1 without sufficient evidence of cancer in humans. So with those few comments, thanks again so much for your wonderful presentation.
Yeah, okay, sorry, it's just a bit problematic to handle the 3 microphones that we are using here in the room. Thank you for your comments. Basically, if you want to comment, Benedetto, the one point was about the conflict of interest of the people participating in the first monograph, whether they would be eligible now to participate according to the new standards that have been developing, like together with the evidence that we have. And the second point that you might comment on, I'm repeating this because we have different microphones and the audio is not terribly good here, but the second point you might comment on was about the role of the mechanistic evidence, which now adds to the experimental evidence and might be even replace it, or at least make it still relevant, but also the mechanicistic evidence is becoming more and more important, let's say.
Okay. You can talk. Can I?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Mary. I, as I told you once, I am somewhat deaf, and I missed a part of your speech, but fortunately, Lorenzo has interpreted it. Well, with regard to conflicts of interest, well, some of the, I have in mind one or two persons who were in that meeting who had very strong doubts about whom I would have some strong doubts about conflicts of interest. Probably in those days, their conflicts of interest were not specific on specific compounds, but it was on. They were very clever persons. Renzo makes comments about this in his book. The doubts that they had were, or better, the certainties that they had were on the impact that the monographs and some evaluations made by a reputable body such as the agency would have on the public opinion, on governments, on industry people, and to keep quiet the trade unions. Yes, probably one or two of them had some conflicts of interest, but in that sense, not regarding specific compounds, etc. Shall we have the names? Oh, okay. The other issue is, can I go back to my slides?
Yeah.
Yes, I jumped over some slides because I had to respect the times. Wait, hold on. Let me share first. That's it. That's it.
By chance.
Right. Yeah. You know, obviously, the inclusion of the biological items which might be related to carcinogenicity, the inclusion of these items in the process of monographs not only has had much success in terms of clarity of the evaluations, but it has found, as I understand, it has found much, it was accepted in the scientific milieu as a major point in the progression of the monographs. I didn't go into the details for one thing that my biological knowledge will become very limited to the information which circulates today. So I would be embarrassed to explain why each of these 10 items is relevant to carcinogenesis. I guess that the circulation of these 10 items and then no awareness of people engaged in carcinogenicity would be extremely, extremely interesting. Am I replying to your question, Mary?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay. Well,
Okay.
let's assume that I did.
Yeah, but it wasn't okay, Mary. So we can. Okay. So thank you very much, and I would like now to ask Rodolfo Saracchi if you want to say a few words or comment or question. Hopefully, you would be able to unmute. Actually, you have to wait for Emanuela Ciliberto to unmute your microphone. Okay, you probably can. Okay, just give me a second. Try to speak.
Can you hear? No, it's blocked.
Yes, we can.
I can? Can you hear?
Yes.
Can you hear me? I can't see anything. I can't. It looks all blocked.
Rodolfo, we can hear you well.
You can hear.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Well, I cannot see me. Can you hear me? No.
Can you? Yes, Rodolfo. Rodolfo, we can hear you well. We can't see you, but this is not a problem. We can't fix that right now. So we can only hear you, but we can hear you well.
You can. Okay. Can you carry on? Yeah? I'm speaking. I don't think you hear me. It's all gone.
Rodolfo, we can hear you, huh? We can hear you well.
But well, I'm going to talk. If in the end don't, that's okay. So okay, all right. So Benedetto, thank you for your presentation because it's been so rich and on stimulating points really, and just brought me back not to the year in which you were at the agency for that first meeting, but a few years later. And I'm glad that you, among the slides, you showed one by Dr. Higginson, the first director of the agency. This is 85. I mean, Higginson had come to the agency in 1966 when the agency really was established in Lyon. And so you have to flavor, I say to the young people, I mean, they are just hearing your presentation and my comments, what the the frame in which Lorenzo Tomatis was operating. He had joined the agency at the end of the 1960s, and then in 72, as Benedetto has shown, I mean, he had started that program in an agency in which the director had the attitude of saying, well, if you want to do it, you can do it, but that is your responsibility. It was not terribly sympathetic to developing that program. In fact, the funding Lorenzo found essentially from the National Health Institute in the United States, because he had a very high, he was highly respected there, and he had been working in the United States for more than 10 years before joining the agency, with some interludes in between. So that was the atmosphere that was there at the agency. Dr. Higginson had a great merit, really, for perhaps the major was of establishing the agency as a place in which you had the labs together with the epidemiology, which was an uncommon situation in cancer institution in general in the 1960s. Is now almost a standard formulation for research in many research institutes. But at that time, it was only in 2 or 3 places around the world. He had, but his own attitude in many respects, particularly for chemical carcinogens, was the one that is emphasized by that attitude on DDT. I remember some discussion with him, and roughly he was saying, well, if DDT would be really a carcinogen, we would see it around, I mean, with people dying, I mean, because of exposure with DDT. This was more of a coffee time conversation, but that was the overall evaluation that he had. So Lorenzo Tomatis to go really in a context which was not only going against the academic, but in a context which was not totally, the wind was not totally blowing in his direction, even within the agency. That is interesting in the sociology of scientific institutions. I mean, there are many, in the end, things converge, but there are many personal views and so on. Now, that was and I was very interested in Benedetto when you showed that slide in which carcinogenesis was mentioned in the 1960s and cancer epidemiology, the number of the papers, I mean, and then they were there. Because it's true that epidemiology of cancer was, yes, there were studies, but it was not that developed. I mean, when I came in, it was because Lorenzo was promoting the fact of having epidemiology coming in, really. That was one aspect. And I think that, and I would like to hear your comment, the real, among other elements, I mean, one of the major factors that created a problem was kind of schism, which happened in 1964, or crystallized. In 1964, Bradford Hill published his classic paper, and the Smoking and Health report of the Surgeon General came out. Both of them really stated that you can say of something that is carcinogen, even if you don't have animal evidence. And that, from that point, it didn't mean that Bradford Hill or the people like William Cochrane, Cornfield, I mean, didn't understand the problem. They said in that issue, really, on that specific issue, we can carry on only with the epidemiological evidence. But that it had a downside of that situation. And because of the importance of the tobacco on health, really it created a kind of dissociation whereby epidemiology is the reference. I mean, and if you don't have the epidemiology, you cannot say anything. I mean, it was immediately read in that direction because of pressure and so on. And that has influenced them. And I say that what Lorenzo really did, though he was an experimental pathologist, he really valued very much epidemiology. Epidemiology expanded under the directorship of Lorenzo, really, because he understood the importance. But he told me a number of times something which I always remember. He said, "You epidemiologist, you have a great, you do a great work, and I appreciate it and I understand the importance so much that the sufficient category 1 really was essentially based, it is based on epidemiological findings. But you have a main shortcoming in your attitude on average, which is you don't say that you have to act unless you have counted the bodies." And that is really what it is, because it's true that as epidemiologists, we have to count the bodies. Or if you don't count the bodies, you count the body still alive but sick. And that is the name of the game in epidemiology. But however subtle is maybe the biological alteration that we are looking at. Okay, so I would like your comment, Benedetto, about this business of setting apart epidemiology because of the tobacco case, really.
About the tobacco, the case of tobacco, then gave much importance to the epidemiological evidence compared to the
maybe respond.
thank you.
Rodolfo, well, okay, you're right about tobacco, that it pointed out the role of epidemiology. But let's go back 10 more years and go to the 50s, when Robert Case had nicely demonstrated with excellent epidemiological studies for the time about the carcinogenicity of several aromatic amines, including 2-naphthylamine. But the reaction of the establishment, to use a word that Lorenzo Tomatis liked, the reaction of the establishment was, oh, okay, epidemiology tells us that there is something about 2-naphthylamine, but we ought to have an experimental proof. Mrs. Bonser, she was in Leeds, if I remember correctly, she did some experiments with commercial 2-naphthylamine in dogs. Which proved that commercial 2-naphthylamine in dogs causes bladder cancer. But the reaction to this was, but that is commercial 2-naphthylamine. We want to make sure that also refined, pure 2-naphthylamine is a carcinogen. Otherwise, our science will not be satisfied. So Mrs. Bonser had to repeat the experiment with pure 2-naphthylamine. I mean, what I'm saying that in the 50s, as a matter of fact, epidemiology did not receive as much attention as it should. You were right with the tobacco story and the 1964 report of the administration of the United States was approved, has changed these. But then the agency came, and that was probably the first exercise in getting together epidemiology and experimental research in an impartial and well-balanced way. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Can you hear? Yes, I can carry on. Yes, correct. But yeah. I mean, that is, in fact, I mean, the whole is very interesting from a pure now moving, I mean, from the context of the monograph to the pure development of methodology, how this causation issue were dealt with, because basically the criteria that Bradford Hill set up, and then you find them in the smoking and health report, they were starting from what was there or before. And what was before? It was what coming from the infectious diseases area, the famous Koch postulates. And Koch postulates include as a key element the animal experimentation. In fact, you said you have to be able to reproduce putting the agent in the animal, the infectious agent. And so in the fact that during the smoking debate, it was taken almost countering that old Koch postulate that demanded the animal evidence, was taken instrumentally, but it has influenced epidemiology throughout for a long period. Really, this kind of put down the the animal evidence, really. I mean, that has happened in many areas of epidemiology. Nowadays, it's probably overcome, but that has been influential.
Thank you, Rodolfo, for this comment and for this debate. I would like to ask if there is anybody in the room who wants to comment or say something, including the students of the master. You can put questions or comments if you wish here in the room, or any of the other people here.
Anyway, you made a nice remark on my quotation of.
Yeah, you should come here, anybody. Otherwise, people who are connected will not hear you. You should speak closer to that computer. Or you can speak here, actually.
Penso che last only, I have only comment when you quote Lorenzo Tomati's sentence regarding the hostility who received the recognition some causes of cancer. So I think this is very interesting because we are a knowledge-based society. So we want evidence provided in scientific criteria to be used for decisions. And this stressing this mood of hostility, I think is a way to, in some sense, show how it's difficult to make pure decision based on rationality, because there are other aspects which can intervene. And this open the room to conflict interest and to other manipulation of the evidence. This is the more dark aspect. The manipulation of the evidence who alter the natural process of scientific knowledge. And I think this is linked to your quotation at the beginning.
To Plato.
To Plato.
That you have made a linguistic remark.
Yes, the original Greek word is panouria, which means to be able to do all kinds of things, bad things and good things.
Can I make a remark? With with regard to conflicts of interest, I would recommend everybody to have a look at the rules that IARC has set about 15 years ago in order to control, avoid, and make it transparent any conflict of interest of the members of the working groups, not only for the monographs, but any working group for IARC. Am I right, Mary?
Yes, absolutely right.
Okay. Any more questions or remarks? Please come. You can sit here.
So hi everybody. Hear me? Thank you for this interesting historical remarks and the current remarks. I should say I have been working as a staff in the monograph for about 2 or 3 years and have participated in at least 5 of the monographs. So I have some more also very recent experience, and I would ask maybe 3 or 2 questions. So one is, when I was there, we very often discussed whether it's still or whether it is a good idea to talk about a yes or no question. So carcinogenesis, yes or no, and not to include more on dose response in the monograph, because low exposure is something different than high exposure. So this was one issue, dose response versus the binary answer. The second issue we may discuss is monograph as still or is still a kind of expert rating. So there are several epidemiological experts sitting together and discussing studies. During the last years, the more formal way of looking at studies like meta-analysis and systematic reviews have become more important also in epidemiology, but this more standardized way of looking at it has, as far as I know, not been included into the evaluation. So this may be another issue, and I see the new boss of the monograph, so maybe she has an thought on this. And maybe as a third point is a question of conflict of interest. I remember one of the monographs I have been participating, there was a completely other conflict of interest there, because everybody who was sitting there was working in the area, and the conflict of interest of all of us were to defend our own studies. Also to get more money to do further studies. I guess this is the conflict of interest you all have as researchers, which I don't know how to deal with it, but I just want to mention that. Okay, that were my point. Thank you.
Well, you raised three points. One is, I would like Mary to add something, but my feelings about the inclusion of those considerations regarding those in the monographs, I will be against it, quite frankly, for the reason that I said is to start with, for most carcinogens, what the risk factor is given by the cumulative dose. That is quite obvious for cigarette smoke, for asbestos, and for many other carcinogens. So how do you know? Daily low doses can amount to considerable cumulative doses to life, in the first place. In the second place, it's not easy to establish those response correlations in the and anyhow, those responses in laboratory animals are meaningless to be extrapolated to men, for one thing. The second thing, well, about meta-analysis, I didn't quite get your point, but my feeling is that in the epidemiological knowledge, which contributes to recent volumes of the monographs, is quite competent. Meta-analyses are very difficult to read, but the reading of the meta-analysis which appears in the monograph, in my mind, is satisfactory. I don't know. Also for this, I would like Mary to say something. With regard to conflicts of interest, you are right. Well, but let's say this, that this is a master course, and the main message from this discussion is directed to the students of the master course. If at the end of this session, the people here has perceived how the epidemiological studies regarding cancer risk risks to be strongly influenced by conflict of interest, that would already be a success with regard to this section. Mary, would you like to add something?
Yes, thank you, Benedetto. And I'd like to say hello to Maria, and thank you for those great comments. The first question, should the monographs put more focus on dose response assessment? Well, this question was actually posed to an advisory group for the monographs back in the autumn of 2013. And before I joined the program, I took part in that as a NIOSH epidemiologist back in the US. And it was quite clear that all of the attendees said that the real focus of the monographs should be hazard identification and not producing dose response for quantitative risk assessment. So that was the very first message. The second message was that where it was feasible, it would be very helpful for working groups to produce or to review quantitative exposure response in exposed human populations. And so I think the program has taken that recommendation forward. But as Benedetto says, it's often very difficult to do that. You may not have a group of studies that are poolable with respect to dose response, and individual ones may give conflicting quantitative estimates. So it becomes a much more complex challenge to try to do that. However, we've committed to documenting the feasibility of doing it at the very least. The second point was using expert review as opposed to systematic review. Well, I would argue that those two are not incompatible. And in fact, the monographs are a systematic review. They adhere to all of the steps within a systematic review in terms of the literature searching, data extraction, assessment of biases and study quality, and very importantly, study informativeness, which is almost never discussed in standard systematic review. But that point of expert judgment being brought to bear on the review of the studies is what really sets the monographs apart. And I would argue it is a very important strength of the program. Lastly, the question about conflicts of interest in terms of being defensive about one's own research, of course, that's an important consideration. And this is addressed in our preamble by ensuring that we include working groups that have a diversity of viewpoints on the interpretation of studies. Another way that this is dealt with is that often we're reviewing more than one agent. And so you have working group members with expertise in a topic like epidemiology who haven't worked directly on an agent. And if we're dealing with a single agent, we would include experts who haven't published in this area, but who would be able to provide expertise. So I hope that complements Benedetto's comments.
Thank you. I think there is also one question in the chat that I can read out aloud, saying that by Paolo Cosignani, saying that an attempt to denaturate the monographs was made when the concept of target organs in brackets was introduced. And he is asking you to spend a few words on this. So the concept of target organs and its impact on the monographs.
Well, I don't know, but the monographs are impacted by epidemiology and by experimental research. I guess that no item of information has been ignored at the writing of the monographs. Probably what Paolo Cosigliano refers to is the volume 100 of the monographs, which was an effort made between 2009 and 2010, when the IARC decided to produce 6 volumes limited to those chemicals to chemical carcinogenic to man and for the indication of the target organs. I must say, and there is a letter of mine at IARC, I imagine. I was not very happy with this proposal. I refused to attend that meeting because essentially, because that would remove the attention and interest to non-epidemiological information. I know that Renzo shared my opinion on that occasion. Nevertheless, IARC has produced, fortunately, they didn't pay much attention to my opinion, and they produced this volume 100, which in fact is a six volume regarding target organs. It is a useful source of information. Well, I still have my opinion that too much epidemiology removes attention to non-epidemiological studies. But I don't think that it has had a big impact on public health, on attitudes of public health with regard to studies on evidence of cancer. Maybe I'm wrong, but as we say in Italian, it left the time which met when it was published.
Okay, thank you, Benedetto, for this answer. Is there any further comment from the room or from other people who are connected? I think that a message we got today, we already know it, but it was reinforced, is that this assessment program, is robust in itself. I mean, it lasted 50 years with no huge changes, and I think this is an interesting message for us as a master program. The fact that you can start programs that last for several years. If you start right from the beginning, then this is going to last and to have a real huge impact, probably above the impact that was expected at the beginning when it was established. This, of course, I don't know because I was not around, but it's certainly 50 years is a really long time to last for a program and to still have such an important impact. I think we can maybe close here. I'm looking at without glasses, so I don't see much, but I'm now looking again in the room whether there are further comments before closing. Otherwise, I would like to thank everybody, especially people who joined on WebEx from IARC and for the contributions that you gave to this discussion. We are really thankful for that. And you can't see the people in the room, but this is, again, also a master program. So this debate was really influential, I hope, and I guess for the training of all of us in this program. And I would like to thank especially Benedetto. This lecture and discussion has been recorded, so we will be able to share with people who were not able to attend today. And again, thank you very much, Benedetto, for being here. And we can close for the day. Goodbye to everybody.
Okay.